don't be shy. They have alcohol over here, more importantly than me. So grab a beer. Canadians in the audience, grab a beer. It may not be Canadian beer, but there you go. So welcome. I think I've got about 30 minutes, but we can have probably a little bit, we can stretch that a little bit, I imagine, with Q&A if we need to, right? All right, cool. So we're here to talk about the future of automotive retail. If you can't hear me, just show hands. And hey, Mike Crawford, how are you? So I'm going to try to convince you in a quick pace, 30 minutes of this, that we are going to see more change in this industry in the next 5 or 10 years than we've seen in the last 100. If I haven't accomplished this at the end of 30 minutes, I've failed. And where might those changes be, right? So look around the show floor or go to any of the seminars, and you'll hear these changes clustered into a few different areas. First of all, and maybe most importantly in the upper left-hand corner, our consumers' expectations in automotive are being recalibrated by expectations that are being set outside of automotive. So think of the Amazonification of the consumer buying and ownership experience, and the transparency that the internet has brought up until the last couple of years with the COVID-fueled profit margins hasn't been very gentle with dealers' front-end margins on both new and used cars, and we're going to dig into that. Number 2 is electrification. You can't go anywhere, pick up a copy of Automotive News today without seeing news about OEMs moving very aggressively towards electrification, the need for charging infrastructure as well, whether the grid will be able to support all these cars in the future, where the energy is going to come from, etc. OEMs selling directly to consumers, as we're seeing more aggressively in countries outside of the US, we're seeing agencies move towards an agency model. OEMs moving toward an agency model, redefining the relationship between the OEM and the dealers themselves. We'll talk a lot about that today. It's top of mind for dealers and creating a lot of anxiety. And then finally, ironically enough, while the cars are becoming more complex from a technology standpoint, at the same time, they're becoming more simple from a drivetrain standpoint. While the battery comprises 40 to 50% of the retail price of the vehicle, the actual moving parts, the replacement parts within an EV are a lot fewer than they are in the comparable ICE vehicle, which is going to impact dealers' service and parts businesses, as well as the OEM's wholesale parts industry or businesses. So one of my favorite quotes about the future is from a futurist named William Gibson, who says, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I believe by looking at what we can find in the press, we can see seeds of the future, some seeds that will germinate into trees. But really the challenge for dealers right now is discriminating between the signal and the noise. There are a lot of these themes that we'll talk about today that may not amount to anything. If you think 5 years ago, many of the large consulting firms were worried that by this point, half the vehicles being sold would be fully autonomous robo-taxis, and it was going to decimate dealers' retail sales. And that has not played out. We'll talk about autonomous today. I'm not a believer that level 5 full autonomy may ever happen for passenger vehicles, and we can debate that. But some of these trends dealers should not be paying attention to. And as I wrap today, I'll try to provide a framework to discriminate between those trends that dealers should be paying attention to and those that they probably just shouldn't be ignoring. So I have a book. I don't have a copy because I just handed out my last copy, but I have a book that I published back in July called The Future of Automotive Retail. And what I'm going to walk you through in the next 20-25 minutes is these 8 thematic areas in the book, and make an argument here that we are going to see more change in the next 5 or 10 years than we've seen in the last 100. So let's dive in. Let's start off first with this relationship between OEMs and dealers, given that we're at NADA. So interestingly enough, 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, GM launches this Hummer.com website where consumers can go reserve a Hummer. The new Hummer is at 100% EV, and consumers could go down, put a deposit, and reserve one of these and elect a dealer for the point of delivery. The challenge was they didn't build enough vehicles to satisfy the demand for these Hummers, putting GMC dealers in a predicament where they got fewer allocations than orders, than reserves. So do we have any GMC dealers in the audience today that can confirm this? We've got one, a large GMC dealer up in Detroit, who's an investor in one of our funds, who had 11 dealers who elected through this experience to buy a GMC Hummer through their store, and they were allocated one allocation. So they put the dealer in a position where they had to literally call 10 of their loyal customers and try to explain to them why the consumer thought they were getting a vehicle at their store and they weren't able to fulfill. So a good example of how theory doesn't necessarily match actual practical realities with OEMs trying to sell direct and sell build to order. Ford, any Ford stores in the audience here? So Ford has recently, as we've seen in the press as of September, asked dealers to self-select into one of three segments. So either spend the facility upgrades where they're going to be able to, on the right-hand side, sell an unlimited number of EVs going forward, or on the far left side, if they aren't willing to make the facility upgrades associated with electrification, they'll only be allowed for the next 2 years to sell internal combustion engine vehicles. So literally, Ian walks into a Ford store and asks for an F-150 Lightning, and the dealer's going to have to tell you, sorry, we don't sell EVs. You need to go to a competing Ford store down the road. Not a good situation. There are lawsuits pending from a number of the state associations now against Ford. How this gets resolved, I don't know. Publicly, they have said that 2/3 of the dealers have elected for this bucket. But I believe we've got about 1/3 of the dealers at this point, so about 1,000 dealers in America who have said, look, for the next 2 years, I'm comfortable only selling ICE vehicles, despite the fact that Ford probably has as hot EV product as anyone. And then we had Volkswagen announced about a year ago that they were going to bring back the Scout brand, 100% EV SUV, which could be a hot product, but they did not signal to their dealers whether or not those Volkswagen dealers would be eligible to sell the vehicle. So what we're seeing, despite the fact that the U.S. has very protective state franchise laws, is what we're seeing is the OEMs redefining the relationship with these dealerships, even if they have franchise laws that protect them, by launching new EV models and new ways to sell directly to the consumer that could potentially bypass some of these state franchise laws. We've heard about pooling inventory within geography. So for example, here we are in Dallas. In this case, this could be GM pooling all of the new inventory into a centralized parking lot. And the GM dealers may or may not have new car inventory on their lots. And I kind of think of this as a library, right? As you need them, you can check the library book out of the library and bring it onto your lot. But I think where this will break down, this theory, is it can't be reconciled back to a U.S. consumer who wants the immediate gratification of walking into a dealer on a Saturday, seeing a comprehensive view of vehicles and being able to test drive. So I think, again, great theory that could potentially save costs from a supply chain standpoint that may not play out in practice. And then interestingly enough, it wasn't lost on me that about 6 months ago, and Ford is the only OEM that I've heard this from, but Ford announced that going forward for EVs, the consumer, and get this, at the end of the lease term, the consumer will no longer have the option of buying back the car at the residual value. So if you think of the implications of this, and the article is around trying to ensure that the batteries come back in and can be recycled, but no one's going to part out a battery on a 3-year-old F-150. So the OEMs may take the opportunity with the introduction of new EVs to start to control the secondary market on these vehicles, and whether or not that grounding dealer will also have an option, as they have in the past, to buy the car or not, could be interesting to see. I haven't seen any of the other OEMs announce something similar, but I would suspect that we may see the OEMs start to control the secondary market, especially as vehicles come out of fleet and come out of lease. And then finally, I thought this was pretty interesting. So for those of us that were at CES a couple of weeks ago in Las Vegas, Sony and Honda, who have created a JV to produce vehicles, they had their prototype there. And they said the way that they're going to go to market with this new vehicle is it's going to be a 10-year lease. And Paul will debate with me about whether the batteries will even be working in 10 years. But the idea would be every year, the consumer that is leasing this vehicle for a monthly payment will get a refresh. There'll be software updates that get pushed to the vehicle. But think of extending the ownership to basically a subscription for a 10-year lease, and those cars won't be coming back into the secondary market after 3 years. So I would imagine there will be other OEMs that look at this keenly and talk about engendering loyalty. If you're locked into a 10-year lease, I mean, there isn't any conquest sales after 3 years, right? You're forcing the consumer to effectively keep the same vehicle for 10 years. Whether the US or Canadian consumers are going to be willing to up for a 10-year lease, I don't know. But it's an interesting concept. And with the advent of these new EV models, they're going to be pushing the limits on thinking about ownership and the ownership cycle going forward. And then as we've seen with the same OEMs overseas, they're pushing more towards an agency model. I was over in Portugal last week presenting to 350 dealers, and the dealers are really concerned about this. I was talking to a Stellantis dealer in Portugal, and Stellantis, as of June, 6 months ago, they announced that they were terminating the franchise agreements with 15,000 of their European dealers, and they were going to replace the existing franchise agreement with an agent agreement. And the difference was primarily going to be that going forward, the OEM, in this case Stellantis, was going to be responsible for marketing to the consumer and for the inventory risk. Dealers were no longer going to be pushed new car inventory. It was all going to be sort of build to order. And from an advertising standpoint, and for those of you in this ecosystem that are responsible for dealers spending money on advertising, imagine a world where the dealer no longer gets co-op and the dealer is no longer responsible for advertising to the consumer. And I'll talk in a couple of slides about why I think this is going to break down, and this may never play out, and especially here in North America. But it is interesting to see these models being pushed aggressively overseas. In this case, Stellantis believes they can cut their distribution costs, sales and marketing costs, by 50% by moving more towards a direct just-in-time inventory model. And Mercedes-Benz, who has globally looked at shrinking their footprint by 10 to 15%, they're facing a lawsuit by more than half of the dealers in Australia because these dealers are saying, hey, when you sold us on this theoretical exercise from moving from a franchise model to an agency model, you grossly misrepresented what it was going to mean to me and the control that I was going to have. So now you've got the majority of the dealer base of Mercedes-Benz dealers in Australia suing the OEM. And again, that won't set legal precedent back here in the US or in Canada, but it's surely something that we should all have on our radar to see how this gets settled. Number two, so you can blame this guy for consumer expectations that have now bled into automotive. So by show of hands, who is an Amazon Prime customer? Okay, this is very typical. There are 167 million Amazon Prime customers here in the US that pay for the privilege of having next day delivery. And it's very, very interesting when you think through the implications of that on automotive specifically. Tesla largely said, hey, if we were going to try to supply or deliver vehicles in an Amazon-esque kind of way, how might we do that? And for who owns a Tesla in here? Oh, he admits to it. It's very rare in an audience like this. Hopefully just to test the experience, right? So people always brag about the buying experience, but not necessarily the ownership experience. Carvana is like the brand that dealers hate and revel in, the current state of Carvana. But I would say to Carvana's credit, they took what would be an Amazon-esque experience around used cars and tried to apply the business model. So as much as dealers like to disparage Carvana, what we've learned from Carvana with setting consumer expectations has implications for all dealers. And then this guy, whether you like him or not, it has been very aggressively pushing and breaking down state franchise laws. So this is a map now of the states in which Tesla can sell directly. The blue and the green states are states in which they can sell directly. The red states still prevent Tesla from selling directly, but they figured out workarounds. And it's paved the way for other direct-to-sale OEMs like Rivian, Lucid, et cetera, to come into the market, which will also then pave the path for new international brands. VinFast is now in the market. They don't need to invest in a dealer model. And you'll have other Chinese manufacturers inevitably come into the US that will have the option to say, do we want to invest in a franchise model or go more direct? So dealers who are here, who are members of NADA, will have more competition in the future, thanks to Elon Musk paving the way to enable a direct-to-consumer future. Vehicle ownership, I mean, this will be a short section because I would say that in general, the subscription model has failed. Many have tried, and very few have made this work. And largely it's because I have a hard time reconciling this, which is the historical depreciation curve on a new car as it transitions to use, with a subscription model that is going to allow me to swap in and out of a vehicle on a monthly basis. There's a reason why leases are typically 3 years in length, because you amortize that depreciation over 36 payments. You can't amortize that first month worth of depreciation on a new car and make the economics work. And many have failed as a result of that. So I'm not super bullish on the subscription model with this flexible, give me a new car, I can flip in and out of it every month. However, what we've seen is some innovation around the lease model. So in this case, Volvo offering a slightly shorter lease, 2 years. They call it a subscription. I would say it's somewhat of a modified lease, but packing in all the costs, right? So I get my monthly payment in here, my roadside assistance, my vehicle insurance. Everything is very predictable to me. And I think this will resonate with younger audiences who maybe are going into ownership for the first time. Give me predictability around my vehicle. Let me switch out of my vehicle more frequently if I want to. But I don't think it will look anything like these subscription models around monthly payments on a new car where I can flip in and out of a pool of vehicles monthly. So let's talk about electrification, power sources of electrification specifically. Many of the consultants now have converged to say, within 7 or 8 years, by 2030 or so, more than half of the passenger vehicles sold will be EVs, either plug-in hybrids or plug-in battery electric vehicles. I'm doubtful. We had some conversation over here at this table a little earlier around this for a number of reasons, but this is where the consultants right now, or at least are converging with what their expectations for new car sales are going to be. But we still have challenges, and those challenges are in these areas, right? So cost aside, because by this point, batteries were supposed to be cheaper than ICE vehicles, internal combustion vehicles, and that has not played out. I think we've had a tripling of lithium prices over the last year and a half. But we still have consumers with a lot of anxiety, right? That anxiety is in a few different areas. First of all, it's like we have range anxiety. How far can I drive with one charge? Number two is charger availability, right? And will those chargers be available? Will there be 3 other cars waiting for that charger when I show up at the Starbucks? And or will the charger work at all? And then we've got charging time. So if you think of that triangle of range, charger availability, and charging time, I think all it really takes is for one of those to start to collapse the anxiety and the resistance. Batteries will get better. We'll have more range. We'll be able to charge them faster. There will be more chargers on the road. But for the time being, I'm very doubtful that we will normalize at more than a third of U.S. consumers demanding an EV, despite the fact that we're going to see a lot more EVs hit the market in the short term. But why is it that we see these kind of broad proclamations from the CEOs of these OEMs? And again, we talked a little bit earlier over here in this corner. The OEM CEO is really trying to appease a few different masters, not the least of which are shareholders. They've got the dealers and they've got the consumers as well. But you really are trying to anticipate what shareholders want, and shareholders, publicly traded shareholders, typically like the fact that you're embracing technology, you're moving more to a subscription model. There's going to be all this high margin subscription revenue coming off, and they really like electrification right now. So by 2035, the U.S. consumer may or may not be ready 100% to buy EVs, but we can always by 2030 blame the consumer for not retooling all of our factories to go over to EVs, and I suspect that's how things will play out in the U.S. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to see a lot more EV models hit the market over the next 2 years. And I believe not every one of these will be a home run. We know that. There'll be the equivalent of a Pontiac Aztek that gets built where there's no consumer demand. Historically, if you overbuilt an ICE vehicle, you could incent fleets to take them. Hertz and Avis only need so many EVs. So what's going to happen? They're going to ship these to dealers' lots. layer in a lot of dealer and consumer-facing incentives, and flood the market. And I think this is going to break the backs in some way of this ideal utopia around this agency model where the OEM takes the risk with the inventory and we build everything just in time, because I don't believe there's going to be a market for many of these EVs that get produced. And then last but not least, we'll circle back to service in a minute here, but I think it's worth thinking through how these EVs, because they don't have as many moving parts, their service intervals are much longer, right? The cars are much less complex, have a lot fewer moving parts to break, but they don't need regular service for oil changes and spark plugs. So the service intervals are going to be much longer. I believe that the billable rate's going to be higher because you need a sophisticated technician with sophisticated tools. And frankly, these cars are dangerous to work on, right? If you're not equipped as a result. But so while the actual pay rate may be higher when you see the cars, dealers will see these cars less frequently. Let's talk about autonomy. I think I already gave this away, but in terms of level 5 autonomy, and the differentiation here is level 4 autonomy is when you can take a nap in the back seat. Level 5 autonomy is when you can take a nap in the back seat in the middle of a snowstorm. And if you think of how autonomy works, right, there are lenses on these cameras, radar, and LiDAR devices that need to stay clean and calibrated. But if you're in the middle of a snowstorm or a fog storm, or I'm from Canada, and we've got some Canadians in the audience, right? There you go. And this time of year in Toronto, most of the cars are caked in salt, right? Salt residue, or whatever chemical they're using on the road right now. The cars are going to recognize that it isn't safe to have full self-driving capabilities, and they're going to pull off to the side of the road and say, hand back control to the driver. But how do they hand back control to the driver if there aren't any pedals and steering wheels in the car? So I think this is what we haven't reconciled. And there's a reason why all of these full self-driving tests take place in Phoenix, Arizona, or in Sunnyvale, California. It's because the weather's always nice and always clean, and these lenses don't get dirty and fogged up. So I think reconciling that work with the practical uses of where these vehicles are being driven has not really been thought through. And therefore, I'm going to make a broad proclamation that we're never going to get to level 5 in my lifetime for consumer uses. But for moving cargo around, that's another issue entirely. We're already seeing great innovation for moving cargo, non-human cargo around ports, for example. You're going to see this on roads, long-haul routes soon, where there'll be a human driver in the cab of the first truck, but there won't be humans in the other trucks. And if ever there's a tire blowout on any of these, they'll all pull off to the side of the road. Like a train, they'll decouple the one that's got a problem, they'll recouple, and they'll get back on that long-haul route from LA to New York. And one hint is, don't try to drive your motorcycle between these trucks. It won't work out very well. But you're going to see this literally within the next year or so on roads, and it'll be very interesting to see this. This will alleviate some of these challenges with shortages in long-haul truck drivers, etc. 2 more to go here. Connectivity. Now we get into the really juicy stuff. Connectivity is interesting. So if you look a year and a half ago, Tesla announced that they were going to remove a feature on the Model 3, and that feature was the adjustable lumbar support on the passenger seat. And they said, in the press release, they said, the reason we're removing it is because 97% of drivers never touch that feature. So not only the car is connected now, they know which buttons you're pushing. They know how often you're using and which months you're using rear heated seats, which is allowing them to figure out which features they need to build into cars, but also, placeholder here, also how much they're going to be able to charge you for certain features going forward. Because obviously, if you're in Toronto, you're probably willingness to pay more for heated seats than I am down in Atlanta. Mary Barra here, a year ago, stood up at an investor conference and said, look, you need to start thinking about us differently. We build a device, the actual high margin revenue is going to be captured after the device is sold to the consumer, not dissimilar from your phone. So at that investor meeting, she forecasted that by 2030, which is now only 7 years away, GM will generate an additional incremental $25 billion of high margin software subscriber revenue per year from the drivers of their vehicles. What's happening, though, the dynamic is these OEMs are having to, you'll hear this term more. I didn't hear it much at this NADA, but this term software-defined vehicle, because the OEMs are looking at Tesla's business model, and they do have envy, but they're having to now buy software developers and pay for software developers. In this case, Hyundai said that they're going to spend $12 billion actually hiring software developers in anticipation of, hey, we need to get more sophisticated and build competency around building software into these vehicles that's going to enable these subscription products, one, to get built, and two, to get unlocked on your phone or on the dash of the vehicle. And what I think will play out is that trying at the same time, simultaneously, to have legacy OEMs retool their factories, trying to figure out the timing to retool their factories from ICE cars to EV cars, knowing that the US consumer probably isn't going to be ready for 100% switchover, at the same time spending hundreds of billions of dollars becoming a software company will break the backs of some of the legacy OEMs and may force consolidation to find scale efficiencies. So I suspect in the next few years, we will see some interesting coming together of OEMs that realize scale is really going to matter, and they will combine forces, because trying to do these two things simultaneously is going to be too much for subscale small OEMs. And then let's talk about subscription models, because this is like a juicy place that consumers really hate to think about. But more and more of the features are going to be built into vehicles that then can subsequently be unlocked on a monthly basis. We talked about heated seats earlier. In this case, BMW got a lot of backlash last summer when they announced in South Korea that going forward, rear heated seats could be paid for up front, or if you didn't want to activate it at the time of purchase, you could activate those for $18 a month on any month that you wanted to use that feature. And they had a lot of pushback, etc. But over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, what's crept in is that you see now, if you go to the BMW configuration in the US, they are offering some of the features either as pay up front or on a monthly basis. So this to me is inevitable. I think we've trained a younger generation of shoppers now to pay for almost everything on a monthly basis. And I don't think this is a bad thing for dealers, but we are going to see more of this going forward. Mercedes recently said, hey, look, we're going to actually allow you on a month-to-month basis to juice up your EV, deliver more power to the wheels, and reduce your 0 to 60 time. So you're going to see more of this innovation. They're going to figure out how, through death by 1,000 cuts, they're going to be able to convince you as a driver to pay for some feature, interior experiences, driving dynamics, range increases, power increases, that the consumer will be able to unlock on a month-to-month basis. The question to me is, how will this revenue be shared back to the dealers? So the OEMs might argue, hey, we built the car, we paid for the software developers, we innovated the new solution. The consumer, 6 months after purchase, decided to unlock that feature. We're not going to share any of the revenue back, right? And right now, I know firsthand that there are dealer councils that are actively negotiating with the OEM, not knowing how big this revenue stream might be, but not wanting to be left out of the picture and trying to pre-negotiate with all that uncertainty what those revenue shares might be. To me, I think it's a great future, because you as a dealership may get alerted 6 months later that Steve, who bought a car from you that you haven't heard from, has now unlocked a feature, and here's your dividend check. Dealers may start to receive dividend checks 6 months, 9 months, 12 months later on cars that they sold, because someone has elected to unlock some features and is now paying recurring. So it could amount to a sizable recurring dividend check to a dealer for doing absolute nothing, if the dealers are willing and able to negotiate with the OEMs for what that revenue share might be. And there'll inevitably be lawsuits. This is the first state that came back that said something to the effect of like, hey, if a feature is built into a car and there's no effort to, needed to unlock it subsequently, then it's illegal. And I don't know, that sounds frivolous to me. I think that there'll be many analogs that are out there, but I can download apps and pay for apps on my phone all day long, right? Just because the feature wasn't built into my phone at time of purchase. Maybe if there was speed, phone speed or memory that was built in, it would be illegal. It seems to me that these won't hold up, and I think this future of subscription services is somewhat inevitable. All right, on to the last thing here. How am I doing for time? Am I good? Okay. The audience seems like pretty captivated, so I'm going to keep going. Over-the-air updates. So related to subscription services is this one. So again, using Tesla as an example. So back in 2018, Tesla launched the Model 3. Consumer Reports tested the car and totally panned this car. They said, and I'll paraphrase, this car brakes worse than an F-150. Elon Musk is pissed off. What else is new? He tweets about this, gets all irate. 3 days later, he reaches back to Consumer Reports and he says, would you mind retesting the car? And they push back. They say, we're very scientific with our methodology. We can assure you, we'll retest the same car, we'll come up with exactly the same results. He finally pushes them. They test the same car. Nobody's touched this car. And the braking dynamics for that car from 60 miles an hour to 0 has been reduced by 20 feet. So this is the event that opened the eyes to all the other OEMs to say, wow, if we can push a software update to a car without any human touching that car and change the driving dynamics of that vehicle, what might we be able to do? And this event has now germinated all this dreaming up of these subscription services. But now, whereas most cars today have to go back to the dealer to get remapped or reflashed or whatever you want to say, this is going to change very quickly. ABI research in the US believes that a third of warranty work will go away because cars will be able to push software updates and the consumer will no longer have to go into the dealership. IHS, these are billions of dollars, believes that the OEMs will save these amounts by year collectively because of the savings from over-the-air updates, either avoiding recalls and or avoiding warranty work. This is all money that would have gotten reimbursed to dealers in their service lanes, right? So we are entering this new frontier, and you can be doubtful this is going to happen. These numbers might not be exactly right, but there is a new frontier where some of the work that would have had to be done in the past at the dealerships will be avoided because they'll be able to push a software update to your vehicle via Wi-Fi overnight. And you'll simply get in the car in the morning, and like your phone, it'll say, your operating system has been updated, and these 3 bugs have been eliminated. The cars, as I said earlier, are much less complex. Now, that one part at the bottom of the skateboard is about 40 to 50% of the entire vehicle cost. So you hear these nightmare stories where someone puts the vehicle up on a jack and it crushes one of the cells, and then you need to replace a Tesla battery. It's like $25,000 or $30,000. That happens. But for the most part, regular maintenance is going to be a lot less, as I said earlier. Parts sales are going to be less over the lifetime of that vehicle, which impacts OEMs as well. OEMs have a very healthy OEM parts business, so they've got to be anticipating this as well. And then Jose Munoz said not too long ago that he anticipates that the average EV is going to, over its lifetime, need about only a third of the regular maintenance of a comparable internal combustion engine vehicle. One of the things that I'm interested to see play out is what will happen to the defection rate of consumers at the end of the factory warranty. So in the US, I've always heard this, and this is substantiated by one of our portfolio companies, about 70% of consumers, once the warranty's over, they defect. That probably changes pretty dramatically by brand, but they start using independent repair shops because the perception is, at that point, it's cheaper to use an independent repair shop, right? So I believe there will be a pretty dramatic flattening of this line, meaning that the loyalty of consumers back to franchise dealers will be much higher going forward for a few reasons. One is the sophistication of these vehicles in terms of the technician skill and tools, as I said earlier. I think that also independent repair shops, the first time some independent technician gets electrocuted, they may be scared off from touching these vehicles, literally. And I also think just the consumer themselves will think, hey, this car's pretty advanced from a technology standpoint. Maybe I better go back to my franchise dealer. So while the service intervals may be longer, I think that the actual pay rate will be higher. I do believe you may see these vehicles less frequently, but over the lifetime of these vehicles, maybe a much more valuable customer from a service standpoint. So stacking them on top of each other, once you start selling these things, I think it'll be a lot easier for franchisees to encourage the consumers to come back and service them at their point of sale. A couple more slides here. Next is this is heightening the concern of the independent repair shop. So we will continue to see Right to Repair Act laws being implemented. The aftermarket is very powerful from a lobbying standpoint, but the practicality, the difference between theory and practicality of you can have an open source where you can work on these cars. It doesn't mean you're going to have a technician that can work on these intricate, very technology advanced vehicles across every single brand. So what does this all mean as I wrap here and we can go to questions? Pre-COVID, we were in an era, remember this era, it wasn't too long ago, of increasing margin compression, right? The actual profitability of running a franchise dealer was being squeezed. And I would argue a lot of this is because of the internet, right? Pre-internet, you had consumers who didn't know what invoice price was, couldn't do a 25-mile radius around your store and beat you up and grind you on other cars that were available in your local market. They had no transparency whatsoever. They didn't know what their trade-in was worth, et cetera. And the internet has brought more transparency, at least on the front end of the car deal, which has slowly ticked down dealer profitability overall. I don't think when you summarize all of these themes, there's a big comment heading, NADA and dealerships are doomed. In fact, quite the contrary. And the reason is this, and I always hesitate showing this slide in front of a group of dealers because I think I'm going to be booed off stage, but I liken running a franchise dealer to be not too dissimilar from squeezing a water-filled balloon. And what I mean by that is this. So if you look at a bird's eye view of a dealership, you've got up to 10 different P&Ls you're running simultaneously that are linked. But at the same time, if we go back to the beginning of the internet, a lot of a dealer's margin was being generated from new car and used car operations. Well, what's happened over the last 20 years? You look at F&I attach rates and F&I profitability as a percentage of total dealer profitability. It's grown from about 20% attach rates to more than like 50% attach rates, depending on the dealership. And F&I profitability in many cases is more than half of the dealer's total profitability. If you look pre-COVID, service and parts, which 25 years ago was not a big area of emphasis for dealers, but pre-COVID, service and parts, according to NADA, was more than 50% of a dealer's profitability total, right? COVID has changed all this with the crazy front and back end gross margins. But I think the elegance and the resiliency of this business model has been exactly this, right? A dealer can look at all these trends and anticipate which ones might start affecting their operations, and then reallocate people, capital, and resources to new areas within the dealership that are going to insulate them and more than compensate for any pressure that they're under. So if I'm a dealer, which I'm not, right? So again, this gets dangerous. Which of these trends would I be particularly paying attention to and how to address would be this. These are the trends I believe out of all of them that I would pluck out and try to pay more attention to. Track the news cycle, anticipate how these things might affect your operations going forward. And I would encourage this, despite the fact that from my experience, dealerships are stuck in 30-day cycles, very focused on hitting this month's numbers, hitting this month's sales and market share and goals and objectives. I would encourage you to work with your management teams to do a simple exercise around these themes. Take this is not my invention, right? This is a very typical risk matrix where on the y-axis on the left is the probability of any of these things occurring. And across the x-axis at the bottom is what's the magnitude, if it does happen, what's the magnitude to my operations? And if you map out things and they either have low probability or they have low magnitude, ignore them, right? They're not worth your time, your mental cycles. The ones that matter are the ones that have a higher probability, and if they do occur, will have a higher magnitude of impact on your operations. I've done that, but I think it's a good exercise for you to do alone, with your management teams, I should say. Figure out which of these trends are going to matter the most. Electrification, for example, subscription services, over-the-air updates, and have a plan. Make sure you discuss these at your 20 groups. Make sure you discuss these at the dealer council, and they're representing you fairly in conversations. NADA has a framework that they launched a couple of months ago, if you haven't seen it, around what their principles are around a lot of these things. So we aren't helpless underneath these things and just a recipient of all these changes going on. Be more proactive. But the main thing is, separating the signal from the noise. Only focus in on those ones that you believe and your management team believes have a higher probability and a higher magnitude of affecting your operations. So with that, I'll stop. I'm sure I'm over time. But are there questions in the audience? All right. Well, there's alcohol at the bar. Please join us, and thank you for your time.